Hello, and welcome to the Evelyn Y. Davis Studios at the National Press Foundation. Today we're talking about budgets. In a minute, we'll talk about trends in federal funds to the states and how the states are recovering from the recession.
The National Press Foundation is a nonprofit dedicated to helping journalists cover complex topics with depth and accuracy. Our mission includes journalists around the U.S. and around the world.
I'm Sandy Johnson. I'm president of the National Press Foundation. With me today are two budget experts from the Pew Charitable Trusts. Barb Rosewicz is a director of research for state fiscal health and economic growth at Pew. And Stauffer is Director of Fiscal Federalism at Pew, and also worked at the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, and the New Mexico State Budget Office. And the federal government sends $3 trillion to the states each year. Walk us through how Pew has recreated the data that the Census Bureau used to publish.
Yeah, Sandy, thanks so much. We really appreciate being here and being able to talk through our data and how it's useful to folks who are looking at the federal budget and the effect on states. As you mentioned, the census used to produce data on federal spending on the states for over almost 30 years until the year 2011, where they published 2010 data and then discontinued the report. So as we await the release of the president's budget, it's really important to sort of look at the importance of federal spending to states and the impact in state fiscal health overall, which is why Barb and I are both here. So as you mentioned, the federal government spends $3.1 trillion in the states, and that is actually 91% of the total $3.5 trillion federal budget in 2013. And changes in federal spending, either up or down, can have a real impact on the states. So people often think of the federal budget sort of as a national issue, but really it's an issue that affects all states and it affects them differently. And this is why we took a look at this data. The data we have provides total federal spending in the states by 5 categories, and it allows you sort of to gauge the importance of the federal spending for each state, and then also the mix of federal spending in the state and across the states. It was a huge data gap for us when the census discontinued the report, and we needed this data for ourselves, but we also wanted to make sure that other analysts had this data so that you could look at what's going on when the federal government spends money in the states.
It's very important to reporters too. Very valuable asset.
Which is why we're happy to be here. Mm-hmm. We recreated it using publicly available federal data, mostly from usaspending.gov and the Bureau of Economic Analysis. We use it ourselves. We obviously want to share it. And we have a spreadsheet with 10 years of data available by category and by state. But right now, what would be really great is to be able to walk through what we looked at and the findings we saw in the data.
Yeah, let's look at our slides.
All right. So the first slide overall is the important, looking at how the federal government actually spent the $3.1 trillion, in the states. So in our slide here, we have the retirement benefits, which is in dark blue, and it's 34% of all federal spending. And retirement benefits include something like Social Security and federal pension payments. The next category is non-retirement benefits in the light blue, and that's 27% of federal spending in the states. And that includes programs like Medicare, unemployment insurance, SNAP, formerly known as food stamps, and Pell Grants. So if you look at the two, the 34 and the 27, the two payments to individuals, that's actually 61% of all federal spending in the states. So 61% of all federal spending in the states goes to individuals. Mm-hmm.
So $6 out of every $10, another way to look at it.
Right, another way to look at it, exactly. And the third largest category is grants to states, and that there is in dark green, 16%. And grants to states is really a term of art that the federal government uses to pay, to describe programs like Medicaid, education, transportation, that are really sort of programs that people think of that are done in partnership between the federal government and states and localities. Mm-hmm. So this grants category actually includes those type of grants to states and also grants to nonprofits and individuals in a state. The next category is contracts. It's light green. It's in 13%. And that is federal spending on procurement done by either sort of defense agencies related to defense or even non-defense procurement in the states. So anything they purchase in the states. And the final category is purple in 10%, and that's salaries and wages, and that's for the federal employees who work for the agencies located in states. So as I said, 3.1 trillion is spent in the states, and that's 90% of the 3.5 trillion. And people often ask what is not spent in the states, right? So it's for us very interesting to know what was spent in the states, but it's sometimes interesting to know what counts as not being spent in the states. And those categories are interest payments on the debt, can't be categorized to any particular state, loans, foreign spending, and spending that is classified, basically. So before expenditures that are for classified purposes that you and I can't know about. So, so the pie chart we just looked at really shows a snapshot. And then one of the things we also wanted to look at is what does it look like over time. So we took a look, 10 years of data. The chart here shows 10 years of data from 2004 to 2013. It's inflation adjusted to 2013 dollars. The top orange line shows total federal spending in the states, and you see it, getting to over 3.1 trillion in 2013. And you can see from the recession that federal spending overall increased sharply during the recession, mostly because of the stimulus and the Recovery Act and other demands on programs that are sort of come into play when the economy has trouble or goes south, as they say.
So the federal spending went up massively because of the stimulus spending, but it's still above $3 trillion. What do you know where that money comes from, the additional funds from before the recession, if the stimulus funds are gone?
Oh, so really what's happening is if you look at the trends, the thing that's driving the sort of increase overall was not only there was the sharp increase during the recession, and then there's sort of been a gradually falling off, but what's keeping it high is mostly the entitlement spending and mostly retirement spending, and that's the dark blue line. And that's sort of the pressure of demographics, of the aging population, increased Social Security and federal pension payments. The other thing that has grew sharply and is just leveling off or only declining slightly is the non-retirement benefits. And those are the categories like Medicare, which is also demographics driven, and food stamps, which remains high even in the post-recession period, and things like Pell Grants, which are also growing for policy and other reasons. So the overall trend has been a sharp increase with a slight leveling off. But what we found interesting is that over the 10-year period, the only category that is actually dropped from 2004 to 2013 is the grants that flow into states. And that, as Barb will talk about later, is really the category that directly affects state budgets. All the categories obviously have an impact on states, but the grants flow directly into state budgets. So we looked at the national numbers, but now we wanted to dig into the reason why we really did this research, which is what does it mean, for each state. So we have did a 50-state map, and we looked at total federal spending in relation to state economic activity. And nationally, that's about 19%. It's equivalent to 19% of state GDP or state economic activity. And we used that indicator, comparison to state GDP or state economic activity, because it's a way of looking at how important the federal spending is to a state in a way that allows us to compare it across states. So it shows what federal funding means for each state, and then you can compare it across states. The important thing to note, what we always mention, is it does not actually show how much federal spending directly contributed to each state's economy. It's really used as an indicator, as a measure of how the importance of federal funding relative to the size of a state's economy.
Well, this map gives a great sort of national picture of what's going on, but if reporters want to drill down to the state level, how do they do that?
Yeah, well, we, on our website, we have the report and the methodology and the data sets for year 2013, but we also have a 10-year data set in an Excel spreadsheet that looks at each category in each state over the 10-year period, and that's available upon request. And we've been sharing it with folks, and we're happy to share it with folks because they're able to sort of drill down into some of the specific regional or state-specific issues that we were not able to do in this report. So, our indicators is sort of like looking at it related to state GDP is sort of, we find best explained by an example, and that is if you look at California and Iowa, federal spending in California is sort of 10 times that of federal spending in Iowa. But if you compare it against their state economies, it's both equivalent to 16% of their economies. So that really shows you that regardless of the total dollar amount, the importance to each state is about the same.
Very interesting comparison. Yeah, good thing for reporters to dig into.
Right, exactly. It's very helpful. And in our map, I mean, you just sort of show that if we look at the map, obviously there's wide variation across the states, even within regions. And by our measure, in terms of by GDP, it shows that federal spending in Mississippi is at 33%, relative to state GDP, whereas Wyoming is the lowest at about 12%. So it really varies. And for the eagle-eyed among the audience, and I know there are probably a lot of eagle-eyed folks in the audience, our legend goes up to 42.3%. That the highest is really DC, but because of the large federal presence here, as we all know, but that's really an outlier, so we don't use it as the top number because that would skew things. So the variation across the states we found really interesting. But the other thing we really looked at and also found very interesting is that when you look at each state and the mix of federal spending in the states, that really varies by state too. So we looked at that as well, and there are lots of potential stories there as well. So we have a bar chart that shows the top and bottom 3 states. We do actually, and it shows the mix of federal spending in each state. We have this data, again, for all 50 states. We just selected these to sort of show the main message that the variation really, the mix of spending really varies. And our favorite example is looking at Virginia and New Mexico. If you look at the chart, the total federal spending is about equal at about equivalent to 30% of state GDP, but the mix is very different. So for Virginia in the light green, you can see that contracts are much more important than in New Mexico. And conversely, in New Mexico in the dark green, you see that grants play a more prominent role. And so if there were a federal spending cut to procurement, you would expect that Virginia would be much more affected. And if there were federal spending to Medicaid or other grants, then New Mexico would be much more affected.
Yeah, I live in Virginia, and there's a lot of defense contractors in Virginia. So I guess that's one of those that contributes to that graph.
Right. And since we all live locally, the news is all full of Virginia and Maryland worrying about the economic impact of that kind of procurement and contracting gradually going down, as they've been seeing actually recently. So this kind of data can really show you the sort of vulnerabilities that each state may have to federal spending changes. What we like to say about this broadly is that national numbers don't tell the whole story. You can look at the federal budget and you think it's only a national issue, but it's not. The story then varies a lot if you look at the mix of spending by state and the total by state. It really gives you a fuller understanding of the impact of federal spending on the country as a whole and in each individual state. And we find this particularly interesting given all the changes that there have been in federal spending even in the last couple of years.
Well, thank you, Anne. Barb Rosewicz is a director of research for state fiscal issues. She brings a journalist's eye to her work. She started her career as a State House reporter in Topeka, reported for the Wall Street Journal, and then was an editor at State Line News Service at Pew. Barb will walk us through some key indicators that can help journalists measure the long-term fiscal health of states.
Hey, thanks, Sandy. The first thing I want to talk about is what's different about what Anne just presented and what I'm going to talk about. So Anne gave us a comprehensive look at the flow of federal dollars to states, and it included money that went to state and local governments and businesses and individuals. And what I want to do is shift gears now and talk about the mix of dollars flowing just to state governments. And these are the dollars that pay for all the essential services that states provide their citizens, from health care for the needy to schools to prisons, to roads and bridges, and really relevant this week is they provide money for snow plowing for state highways too. So as state legislative sessions rev up, we have an online resource at the Pew Charitable Trust called Fiscal 50 that I think could actually be a gold mine of data and analysis and story ideas for journalists who are following the money in state governments. What we do is we analyze 50 state data, but on a carefully selected group of indicators that help you size up a state's long-term fiscal health. So I emphasize long-term because that is one of the things that distinguishes this data set from others that you would have access to. The other thing that I think is unique is that we are not just transferring data that we get from somewhere else and putting it into an interactive for you to click around. We are fashioning an indicator with a particular insight into your state's finances. And then we don't leave you to figure out what it means. We actually describe what it is that we found. So if you're a journalist, you can quickly grab our takeaway, customize it to your state, and go.
Sounds very valuable.
I hope so. So we encourage journalists to take screenshots of the graphics, and in addition, we provide downloadable data so you can actually take it into a spreadsheet yourself, make your own graphics. All we ask is that you attribute it to the Pew Charitable Trust and Fiscal 50. And there are two levels on which I think this could be useful. Here I am putting on my journalist hat from former life. But one is if you're a national reporter, this really could help you get below the U.S. statistics. So you could see what it was that Ann had talked about the great variation among the states. So you would be able to look at this and see how unevenly states are coming back from the Great Recession, for example.
Exactly.
And the other way is if you're a reporter on the front lines in state houses, you have access to the most up-to-date data coming out of your state offices, but there's a perspective you can't easily get inside the walls of the state house, and that is, how is my state doing compared to other states and over time? And so what this does is shows you some of those trends so that you can then go back to your state and ask appropriate questions to help get to the bottom of things. So today I'm going to highlight just the revenue-related indicators that are part of Fiscal 50. And revenue, of course, is supremely important in states because, unlike the federal government, states can only spend the revenue that they take in. So this really defines what the state's priorities are. And we have our first slide is this is what Fiscal 50 looks like when you come to it, and you can click on all of these different indicators. Let's take a look at where states' money comes from. Now, this is a bigger picture of state government revenue than you get in your state budget, because the state budget is a general fund, and it is just typically smaller than all of the rest of the money that you get, because as you can see, you're getting money from several sources. The first that I want to concentrate on here is the part in green. And this is one strand of the same federal money that Ann had been talking about that flows to states. And this is important because it's the second largest source of state revenue. I'm not sure that people always know that federal dollars make up that much of state spending. And in the year of fiscal year 2012, which was the latest data as of this point, these dollars made up 31.6 cents of each state revenue dollar.
Now, Barb, do you have this data available state by state as well? This is a national picture, right?
This is the national picture. What we have is the trend of what has happened to federal revenue as a share of state revenue. And this is what you would actually find if you come to Fiscal 50. So as I mentioned, this is all 50 states' revenue clumped together, and you can see what has happened in the long-term role. And this shows us the role that the federal dollars have played in states' budgets. It's changed over time, and it shows you how much federal budget decisions matter to states. Now, in the years following the Great Recession, thanks to the stimulus, federal funds actually made up a bigger share of states' revenue than they had in the 50 years for which there was data on this.
Half a
So
century, wow.
It made a big difference in helping the states get through the Great Recession. So now that the stimulus has expired, we're seeing this ratio move back toward typical levels. So pre-recession, in the 10 years before the recession, it's typically been, though, between a quarter to a third of state revenues. It's just always in that range. This is where you're going to see effects, though, if there are any further limits on federal spending and that money that comes into states, and also when we start getting data on the effects of the Affordable Care Act. So those states that have expanded and are now covering childless adults will be getting greater federal dollars, and we'll start seeing this show up in this, and also providing even more variation among the states as time goes on, because it really does vary among states.
Now this data is through 2012, and you're expecting an update on this soon?
Yes, in fact, very soon, because the Census Bureau will be coming out with the data that we use for this next week, in fact. So it'll take us a bit of time to pull it in and analyze and get it into the interactive. But I would appreciate for people can check back and see this, or you can sign up and get an alert. Whenever we do an update, we will send an alert to people who are interested and let them know that the new data is up along with new analysis. So I mentioned the variation in states. So here we can see the states that have the greatest and the smallest shares of their revenue coming from federal dollars. And Mississippi, as you can see here in green, actually has the highest federal share, and that's largely driven by the fact that Mississippi had the highest federal matching rate for Medicaid in the country. So Medicaid is a big component of what we see in the federal dollars that go to states. And as you see in orange, Alaska had the smallest share of total revenue, and its Medicaid match was the minimum, which is still 50% of all Medicaid costs. But primarily there, it's an issue of the state traditionally has taken in so much revenue from oil sales that the federal dollars are just a smaller portion of the other revenue that's coming into the state. So I'm going to go back now, and we're going to talk about the piece of this in blue, which is the portion that comes from state-generated dollars, and that is its own tax revenue. And as you can see here, it was 49% as of fiscal year 2012.
Has that 49% stayed basically static, or does it move around quite a bit?
Actually, it's interesting with that number because in some ways it's a mirror image of what we saw in the federal share indicator, that as federal dollars went up, the share of the total pie coming from the state was small. Now the stimulus is coming down and federal revenue, and I'm sorry, state-generated revenues are going up. So you're likely to see it come back up. Over the past 10 years, the average is more like 52%, so I think we're probably gravitating back towards something like that.
But half, roughly.
Roughly half, yes. It's always been in that range, or at least in the data we've looked at. So the way that Fiscal 50 looks at state tax revenue is, I mentioned that we have a particular insight that we're going for. And in this one, what we do is we take the data and we measure to see how much state tax revenue has recovered from the Great Recession. And we adjust dollars for inflation, so we're looking at constant dollars across time. And this is the trend for 50 state total revenue. Think of it this way. This shows the state's purchasing power from its peak, as you see in 2008, to the end of the fiscal year 2014. Now, the first thing this tells us is that as a result of the recession, it took 4.5 years for states to get back to the same purchasing power that they had in 2008. That line goes down and it doesn't break above zero until 4.5 years later. Another way to think about this is that, just talking about constant dollars, that is as if the state got $1 in 2008. The bottom of the recession was getting 13 cents less, so they were getting 87 cents worth of purchasing power. And in the most recent quarter, they're getting 1.6 cents more. So that means they have 2 cents more of purchasing power, But over all of those years, they've had a lot of increases in demands too. So we've had population increases and the increases in the numbers of school-age children and more people on Medicaid rolls. So states don't have a lot of wiggle room, as you can see from this.
That's a good way to look at it. Barb, if I could interrupt, we have our first question. Fred asked, is there a way of finding out where my state revenues come from?
I would think that you should be able to pull that out of the same data source that we have been using to do this conglomerate. So it's the Census Annual Government Finance Survey, I think is actually the name of it. And if you look on Fiscal 50 in our sources, you will actually see a link to it. So you should be able to go there and pull it out state by state, and you could put something together like that for your state.
Great. We'll put a link up when we post the video.
That's a great idea, actually. So when it comes to how states have done, it really matters where you live. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples here. If you are from North Dakota, which you see here in orange, you would be riding the state's oil boom to a revenue high, and North Dakota has had the greatest increase in tax revenue since its peak during the recession. And so it's 119% above what its high point was before the recession. This data, I will say, does not, though, include what has happened to oil prices since maybe, June or so.
Right.
So it's likely still to stay pretty high, but it will be affected by that. Now, interestingly, farthest from peak, as you see here in green, is Alaska, which is also an oil state. So what's going on here? What this is actually showing is that in 2008, Alaska benefited from having a new windfall profits tax on oil at the same time that crude prices hit their highest level ever. And so they had a big run-up in tax revenue that year, and it proved to be unsustainable. They've never collected that much again. And so that's why its number is low, and again, it also will be affected by falling oil prices. And on Fiscal 50, you can actually go to this and compare 3 states at a time, and you can compare it there to the national average as well.
Great. And reporters can use, if they do a 3-state comparison, they can use that graphic attributed to Pew.
Yes, and the best way to do that is either create it yourself or take a screenshot, grab a screenshot of it. That's the easiest way to do it. So overall, how are states doing? This is also on Fiscal 50, and this is the current standing using the latest 50-state data, which is through the end of June 2014, and we expect to get some new data on the next quarter very soon as well, so you might watch for that. So it turns out that in blue we have 21 states. So in 21 states, their tax revenue adjusted for inflation has recovered to prior peak levels. And that includes North Dakota, where tax revenues are up because of the economy, but it also includes states like Illinois, whose tax revenues are up, but in part that's because they had a tax increase. And so at least half of the states in blue had some kind of a tax increase since the recession that pulled their tax revenue up. And of course that leaves 29 states shown in orange where tax revenue, at least the purchasing power of it, was still running behind. So what I think this map makes clear is that even though we're seeing recovery in the US economy and in the stock market and the unemployment rate is falling, the recovery of tax revenue is still really uneven across the states. And so the effects of the recession aren't over when it comes to the states. It continues to be felt, and it really matters where you live. And there's a wide variation about how dramatically states were affected by this and how much they still are affected by this.
And we're seeing that play out as the governors release their State of the State addresses and talk about the revenue picture for this upcoming year. There are at least 8 Republican governors that are talking about raising taxes in very red states like South Carolina, Utah, and South Dakota.
Yes, in some of those instances, you have to think it's 8 governors. You mentioned 8 governors. There are 31 Republican governors now, and so there's still a lot of attention to holding down tax rates as well. In some of those cases, they're looking at doing a kind of a swap. So if I raise one tax somewhere else, like a gas tax, I might actually be lowering an income tax.
I think that's the case in South Carolina, right?
Right. So they're not all of those are actually proposing tax increases. But I think you're right that it speaks to where states are finding themselves, and that trend that I showed you that said they don't have a lot of wiggle room since the recession.
Oh, there's a question here about the baseline. The recovery since what year? I guess that might speak to the line graph.
Oh, yeah. So thanks for asking that question, because it's a good point that what we did is for each state, we went back and calculated what their peak quarter was. Now we do, it's called a 4-year moving average, which means it's not, if I just charted the 4 quarters, it would be up and down because of seasonal variations. But so for each state, we calculate what the peak was, and we only measure it to that state's peak. It's interesting that, this is the way the state revenue works, but in a lot of the states, the peak actually occurs after the recession started, and that makes sense because you're collecting tax revenues in the following tax year. So in most states and nationally, it actually peaked in 2008, which is after the recession started, which was the end of 2007. So let me ask, what do you do when state tax revenues don't come in as expected? And we have something to tell you about that too. This is where states' reserves come into play. And reserves are a crucial instrument that policymakers have in their toolbox to manage their state finances and still provide those essential services that we were talking about for their citizens. And Fiscal 50 looks at reserves in this way. For each state, we take the data that states themselves have submitted to the National Association of State Budget Officers, and we do a really simple calculation, which is we express it on how long a state could run just on its reserve funds alone. Reserve funds here are defined as rainy day funds and ending year balances, so not just rainy day funds alone. And it's not that a state would ever do that, but it's what Ann talked about too, is that if I just compared states on the basis of their dollars, it wouldn't be very meaningful because those states have really different sized budgets, and the idea of a reserve fund is to help you provide some protection for your budget. So that's the way that we use to give you a more meaningful way to look at states and to see how they rank. So let me take a look here at a couple of states. So the first perspective that you gain from Fiscal 50 is this long-term trend. And I chose these 2 states just because they have interesting stories. And you can look at your state's long-term trend, and I will bet you'll find something really interesting in it as well. And these are interesting to me because they have an interesting story, and the saga of these states' reserve funds is still in the hands of legislators this year. There's still something interesting going on in both of those states. So let me talk first about in green, which is California. And what you can see here is that California's financial cushion was actually drained for 4 years after the recession. So its rainy day funds and ending balances actually fell into negative territory, and the state had to scramble to pay the bills that year and put off some things. But its revenues began recovering. It had some tax increases, it cut spending, the economy got a little better, and by 2014, California's reserves had rebounded to about 14 days worth of operating cost. Now, you can see that that is still below the blue line, which is the 50-state median. So that means that we can say California's reserves are still in the lower half of states. Interestingly, though, in November, the voters in California passed a ballot measure that will take steps to replenish the rainy day fund by grabbing some revenue in boom years and putting it away for the lean years. And the governor and the legislature right now are involved in the nitty-gritty of figuring out exactly how that's going to work and how to put it into action.
And I think that was actually the result of a squabble between the governor and the legislature last year over some additional revenue that came in, and where should they spend it? Should they put it in reserves? Should they spend it on education?
That is a common debate. California has a particular issue in which its capital gains fluctuates pretty dramatically, and we're actually going to talk in another few slides about what happens when you have those kind of revenue swings. Now, the story of the other state that I was showing you, West Virginia, it's very different. So after the recession, all states had a drop in tax revenue. But West Virginia benefited because it had high energy prices and an increase in oil exports at that time. So it kind of made up for some of the drops that it had in other revenue. And as a result, West Virginia was actually one of the few states that did not tap its emergency reserves during the recession. And so its reserve got to as high as 141 days worth of operating costs, which was fourth highest among states. Now, more recently, though, demand for coal has fallen and energy prices have fallen, and so its revenues have started to flatten. And after not touching its rainy day funds immediately after the recession, in the current budget year, they actually went in and took a modest amount out of reserves, and they used it to bridge a budget shortfall. And there's a current debate in the legislature this year about, again, taking a small amount, it's only a small amount, but out of the reserve funds to bridge a budget shortfall. Now, this is what rainy day funds are for, which is a rainy day. But still, it's a big decision for a state of when you would actually go in and start using some of those reserve funds. So you might be wondering, how does your state's reserves rank compared to others? And in Fiscal 50, we actually rank states and have a bar chart showing all of them. But I'm going to start here with the states that have the biggest reserves, and the one I'm not mentioning, the one I'm not showing is actually Alaska, because it's so big that if I included it in the graphic, it would just dwarf all of the others. So let me just tell you that Alaska at the end of fiscal year 2014 had expected to have $13.3 billion, or 663.9 days worth of expenses, almost 2 years worth. So it's more than any of the other states. Just take my word for it. Now, after Alaska, these are the states that had the greatest financial cushions in days of operating expenses. And one of the things you might notice is that Wyoming and North Dakota are among those. And of course, those are both oil-producing states. And there's a reason that states that have a great reliance on oil like to have larger reserves. And again, that's because of swings in energy prices. And I'm building up to that. So let me, though, quickly show you the states with the smallest reserves. And a few of these may not be surprising to you. But Illinois' financial cushion, as you can see, was just under a day, and Pennsylvania had just a day. Now, all of these states actually have among the lowest credit ratings. Credit agencies look at reserves as a measure of fiscal health. And Moody's reports recently had chided these states actually for having a low amount of reserves, because that means they don't have a lot of resilience to fall back on if there's another fiscal shock.
Well, not every state has a dedicated rainy day fund, correct? I mean, some have year-end balances, but...
Well, all the states have year-end balances, and rainy day funds, budget stabilization funds, they go by like a variety of names. Not all states have what are formally called rainy day funds, but they do tend to have reserves. And it's considered a good fiscal practice, though, to have a budget stabilization or a rainy day fund. So I had mentioned this idea of swings in revenue. And this is the last thing I'm going to be talking about on revenue today. And that is that reserves play an important role in something that is called tax revenue volatility. And we have a new edition, our newest edition to Fiscal 50 is actually a data set that we just posted this month. And what it allows us to do is to rank states based on their tax revenue volatility. Now, Alaska is a great example of tax revenue volatility and why it matters. So remember when I showed you the graphic with tax revenues and Alaska had that big peak?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's largely because of oil prices had gone up that year. Well, now Alaska's in the situation that oil prices have fallen like by half since the time they put their budget together last year. And so that shows us about the revenue swings that a state that reliant on oil will have from energy prices. These kind of fluctuations in year-to-year tax totals are what's known as tax revenue volatility. And they matter because it makes it much harder for state officials and policymakers to forecast their revenues and to keep budgets in balance if they don't have a predictable idea of what revenues are going to be coming in. So all states experience some kind of revenue volatility, but it varies widely. Same theme that Ann had. We see a great variation in this. And not all states are as prepared as Alaska to deal with the volatility because they don't have as great a number of reserves. And Alaska's reserves are not just a coincidence. It built up those reserves because it recognized that it had this volatility in its main revenue source. So what's unique about the data set that I'm going to show you now is that what we do is we remove the estimated effect of known state tax policy changes. And the reason we do that is because we're trying to look at the underlying trend. So like what's driving this tax revenue volatility? What is it that's beyond policymakers' control that's driving this tax revenue volatility? So we think this is really important information for policymakers, and it really gives you a much better sense of what they're contending with each budget year when they're trying to forecast revenues and then make sure that the budget is actually balanced at the end of the year as well. So in this slide, you can see that the four most tax volatile states in the country are led by Alaska. And that would surprise you now that I've shown you everything about Alaska. So now to clarify what this calculation means. A volatility score, let's say Wyoming is 12.1. This indicates that total tax revenues have typically fluctuated 12.1 percentage points up or down from year to year over the past 20 years.
Could you talk about the methodology? And you can use one of these states as an example if you'd like. How does Pew come up with this?
Well, we look at 20 years worth of tax revenue, and we calculate the change year to year. We remove, as I mentioned, the effects of tax policy changes. And the reason we want to do that is because if I didn't and there was a tax increase, that would have sent that percent increase up really high that year. And so we remove that so you don't have it influencing the percent change. We take those 20 years and we use a standard deviation, which is a calculation based on a formula that allows us to take this like 20 years of percent changes and conglomerate them together into one number. And that one number gives us a way to be able to compare states to each other. So we do this for all state revenue, all state tax revenue, careful, it's tax revenue for each state, so I can rank states. And then we go on to look at the major tax streams in that state, and we apply that same calculation to each of those major tax streams to find out, which of your tax sources really are the most volatile.
Now, is this another indicator that reporters can go in and compare several states at a time, or is it a 50-state ranking?
It's actually both. So you can go in and see the bar charts that compare 50 states at a time, their overall number. And then I'm going to show you an example of how you can drill down and actually look at the tax revenue streams and what has happened to them over time. You can't really compare, there'd be so many lines you couldn't really compare one state to another, but you can actually just click through and almost like run your own little slideshow of what's happening in each state just by clicking through the states one at a time. So what we found is that the intensity of revenue fluctuations vary greatly from state to state, but it's worth noting that in 39 of the 40 states, the volatility scores ranged between 3 and 7. So that just gives you a guideline. When you look at your state score, you can kind of see what norm you were in. And again, remember, we're measuring underlying volatility. So these are things, because we took out the tax changes, we're not looking at the effects of any policy. We're trying to look for things that are driven by other factors, and these include economic conditions. It could be your mix of industry or the type of natural resource you have and how your tax structure interacts with that. Population growth, changes to federal tax laws can have an effect in a state, or unforeseeable effects, unforeseeable events like natural disasters. Like I imagine there'll be a bill from the snowstorm we had, and Hurricane Sandy or Hurricane Katrina fall into that category. Those are all the things that are out of these policymakers' control.
We've got a question, Barb, for you. How does Pew, or actually the question is, what methodology do you use to remove the impact of tax policy changes on volatility? I guess, how do you extract that?
Okay. If you look, first I'll say you can read about it, because we have an actual methodology section with each indicator. And I would also mention we peer review all of these methodologies too, so you can have confidence in them. And you can read about the methodology, but the technique that we use is we use the National Conference of State Legislatures each year takes information from state legislative staff about the tax changes that they've approved that year with an estimated impact. And we take that estimated impact and actually then remove it from the data of tax revenue so that we're not counting it when we're looking at the next year's percent increase change.
Mm-hmm. And what's an example of an organization or person you would use for the peer review?
We use a lot of academics who have written on these subjects. We've used economists, people who have served as state budget officers previously. So generally people who have some a lot of prior knowledge, some expertise, and have written in it or have had a career in it.
Okay.
So we haven't looked yet at the states at the bottom of the tax revenue volatility ranking. And here you can see that these are the states then we would say have the more stable revenue, and that's the result again of whatever of the interaction in those particular states of their tax policies and probably some unique economic characteristics. So I can tell you that South Dakota, which has a volatility score of 2.6 here, it relies primarily on sales tax revenue, and its sales tax revenue is one of the most stable sales tax revenue streams among all of the states And Kentucky, similarly, it relies primarily on sales tax and personal income tax, and those also are, among all the states, theirs tends to be the least volatile of all of those. So you can have a sales tax in one state that could be a lot more volatile and a sales tax in another state that would be less. It really depends a lot on each state's own conditions. I mentioned the idea of, this is what you can also see, of you can drill down into your state and see what is it in each state's tax revenue streams that could be driving this volatility. Now, it also depends on how much the state depends on that particular revenue stream as part of its total revenue. So you could have like a really small tax with a lot of volatility, but it won't matter that much because it's such a small amount of revenue. What we show are only the major tax streams in a state. And we actually show up to 4. There are a few states that may have 6. So if anybody wanted to use this, I'd say go look at the downloadable data, make sure that you're capturing all of the major tax streams in your state.
When you say major, can you put a percentage to that?
Yes, so we quantified this by saying we're going to look at the states that have the tax streams that produce at least 5% of the state's tax revenue over the past 10 years, averaged over the past 10 years. And so that's how we identified the major tax streams. So looking at the slide again, I picked New York here. Its major tax streams are corporate income, sales tax, and personal income tax. Now, New York's overall score is 6.2, and that puts it in like the middle third of states. So it's not a particularly high revenue volatility state. But what this does show me here is that its corporate income tax was the most volatile tax revenue. Its score was 22.4, followed by its personal income tax, much lower at 8.4, and a sales tax, even lower at 4.7. So it gives us a way to kind of rank within a state the volatility of those tax streams. Now, interestingly, the other reason I put in a corporate tax income volatility slide is because we found that corporate income tax revenue seesawed more than any other tax source in 24 of the 29 states where this ended up as a major source. And if you looked, we did a comparison of how does corporate tax income behave compared to personal tax income, and in 25 states that had both of those as a major tax, corporate income tax was more volatile than personal income.
I get why that would be interesting and important to lawmakers and policymakers. How would a journalist interpret that?
Well, one of the ways that I talked about it is just a deeper understanding of what it is that's going on in your state and what the importance maybe of the revenue estimating process. Because if you miss on a revenue estimating process and you can come up with a shortfall, and then you have to take cuts that you hadn't really had a lot of time to think about. Or on the other side, if you end up with a surplus and you didn't really have a procedure for taking care of the surplus, you know, you may spend the money and then wish later that you'd spend it another way. You may have to make a short decision. I also just found it really interesting to get an understanding of each state's taxes and how they've put together the mix of their taxes. It helps explain, like in a state like California, why they even made this move to have a new procedure for replenishing its reserves, and it's because its capital gains tax as part of its personal income had such great volatility that a little change in the economy and the state would have a big change in its revenue. Mm-hmm. So I think it just adds to your overall understanding of how the economy plays with the state's finances. Mm-hmm. So mostly I just wanted to mention here that we've had some great examples of how the media has already used Fiscal 50. I've seen them use them in spot stories when we update data. I've seen great examples of they pull out a state's ranking and they put it in context of a new piece of data that they got out of their state. And what you're seeing scrolling here is, I want to give a shout out to the Dallas Morning News, because I think this was like the best use that I'd seen so far of our tool, that they took each of the indicators, which we say are important indicators for long-term fiscal health, and customized it to Texas. They pulled out Texas's data. They used our analysis that tells you how to talk about it and what it means, and they came up with little capsules for each of those for Texas, and I think gave a really good overview of what was going on in Texas.
Something for reporters to look at as an example.
It is.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. We have a question. Now, this one might actually be for Ann. So does the state money that you're talking about, when it includes the federal dollars, are you calculating money allocated or money spent?
Oh,
I guess as a percentage
right.
of the overall GDP.
Right. Our data is all based on outlays or money spent.
Money spent.
So that's why it also is through 2013, because that's when you have the actuals data.
Okay. And what other economic data does Pew have that might be interesting to reporters?
I want to mention a couple more that we have just in Fiscal 50. And one is instead of looking at unemployment rates, we choose to look at employment rates, and it gives you a very different perspective on the state's job situation. And the reason that we do that is because the unemployment rates don't include people who have stopped looking for work. And so we chose to do what a lot of economists do, which is to look at the share, just the share of the population who are working, how many of the share of that population between the ages of 25 and 54, those you most expect to be working, how many of those were working before the recession and how many are working now, and then we calculate the difference. So it gives you a different perspective on the state's economy and the job situation. And another one that's really important to the long-term fiscal health of states are these, the challenges that you have from public employee retirement costs. And so we actually have an indicator in which we put up the data on what the total debt is for the state versus what its unfunded liabilities are for pensions versus what its unfunded liabilities are for employee retirement costs.
And reporters can find that at the URL that's posted on the slides.
Yes, and it's pewtrusts.org/fiscal50, and it'll take you straight to my site.
Right. And then if I can add, on the federal side, we also look. We have some more data up that looks at sort of the trends in grants to states overall. It uses a slightly different data set, but it shows, not only things like Medicaid is actually 2/3 of all grants that go directly to states, and it shows sort of trends disaggregated over time by different categories, showing that healthcare is basically driving the increase in grants to states that has happened since the recession. And my project also looks at the tax connections, when federal tax policy changes, how it affects states, because as Barbara alluded to, their tax codes are also connected to the federal tax code. And so we're doing a project where we're hoping to do 50 state analysis of when federal tax law changes, what does it mean for state tax revenues? And that's coming in the next couple months.
That's great.
So.
Well, thank you. Today we've heard from Barb Rosewicz and Ann Stauffer, two budget experts from the Pew Charitable Trust. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sandy.